Okay, here we are, video number 3. In this shorter video, we're going to look at some advice from the PhD examiners that we've interviewed for this process about the written work, the oral examination, and some pointers they have that they would regard as areas for concern if they were encountering those from a candidate through this process. So this video is shorter than the middle one, and I hope you'll find it useful. So let's think first about the written work, and as we've done throughout this session, let's look at a quote from an experienced PhD examiner. I'm assessing academic quality, coherence, good judgment about scope, independent thinking, plus use of critical material. Now, I picked this quote because it was the shortest, which is to say the most succinct, the most straightforward, but I wanted to emphasize that of the different PhD examiners that I interviewed in putting this workshop together, there was 100% unanimity about what they said in response to the question, what are you looking for in the written work? So this list, I think, is a really valuable summation of the kinds of criteria, the kinds of expectations that they will bring to their reading of your written work. It also strikes me that this list is completely predictable, and if I had asked you without seeing this quote to brainstorm what you thought the examiners would care about, what you thought they would be looking for in your written work, I am certain that this is the list you would have come up with. In your own words, no doubt, and perhaps not in that order, but I think the basic elements of this that this examiner and the other examiners are saying that they look for, I think is very straightforward. In other words, I don't think getting through the first year registration process is a dark art. I think its expectations are pretty clear. I think that what we are dealing with then, and as I've said elsewhere in the session, also the mechanics of producing 10,000 words can't in itself be the challenge for people who have almost certainly produced longer dissertations than that in order to get to where they are. The challenge must be something else, and one of the ways I wanted to reflect on that in this section is around your emerging scholarly identity. So here's a quote from a fantastic book by Kamler and Thompson called Helping Doctoral Students to Write. Both of these people, and Pat Thompson in particular, have published an enormous amount about doctoral education and writing skills and developing good writing habits. And they describe the writing process and what it is that when we are academic writers, when we're producing something, what is, as it were, happening below the waterline. And they say that academic writers are also presenting their integrity, credibility, involvement, and a relationship to their subject matters and their readers. And I think the relationship to the subject matter and to the readership, the spheres of engagement, the kind of debate that you might want to intervene in, is stuff that I hope we covered in that middle section where we began to prompt you to think a bit further on that. But integrity, credibility, and involvement, that's something I think we should just take a moment to consider a bit further. In a different book, Pat Thompson elaborates that in a way that I think is particularly helpful. And she says here that the struggle with the PhD is because of the difficulty of negotiating text work and identity work simultaneously, while at the same time explicating and positioning the research. And this next line seems to me to be really pertinent here. The challenge is to learn to speak with authority. So I've done this session many, many times over many, many years, and it is almost without fail, it is the case that one or two people will say that they're really nervous about the first year report. They're very worried about how to describe the thinking they've done, how to describe the work that they've done. So one of the things I think that's really worth emphasizing here is you are not alone. We talk a great deal in academic circles in research and development about imposter syndrome. What's the great irony of imposter syndrome is that people who are feeling like imposters also tend to assume that nobody else is an imposter, that they're the only one, whereas of course actually the research overwhelmingly shows almost everyone has feelings of imposter syndrome. But what it's talking about here, the relationship between the text work and the identity work, or if you like, the kind of intellectual work and the psychological work is the way that I sometimes describe it to myself, of putting the PhD together. A bit of it is your brain power, kind of like churning through these key questions, engaging with the literature, finding the debate you want to be part of, working out what kind of stance you want to take on it. And another really important bit of it is working out who do you want to be as a scholar. And it can be that this pivotal moment going into the second year, so passing out of the first year into the second year and going through the reflective process that is the first year assessment, can be a really useful time to, again, as I've said elsewhere, step back from the immediate task of producing the words and ask yourself this bigger question around who you are as a scholar. So here's an exercise that we often do together, and it is literally just an open discussion, a group of researchers talking to one another about what kind of identity they think they have currently and are taking on as a scholar. Now, I pay no attention in particular to these adjectives. These are just ones that I bunged up on the side in order to demonstrate the point. So it could be that you're feeling very strongly aligned to a particular kind of methodology or to a particular critical theoretical paradigm, or it could be that you're feeling very strongly aligned to a particular political philosophy. It doesn't really matter what that is. It doesn't really, I think, prevent you from engaging constructively with this process if it turns out your examiners come from a different paradigm. What's useful, I think, is to start to shape your understanding of who you think you are as a scholar so that you can identify who else out there has a sympathetic approach, who is likely to be skeptical. And for example, on very practical levels, if I think about my background in German literature, it was broadly, and with apologies for how reductive this is, but broadly for the sake of argument, there were two camps. There was the historicist and there was the critical theoretical camp. And those who liked Freud and Derrida were on one side of the fence, and the historicists were on the other, and to some extent they published in different journals and went to different conferences. I'm not suggesting that we should be upholding those kind of tribal distinctions. I think that actually the goal is to find ways to speak across paradigms and across traditions. But you can't really do that, I think, without starting from a stable position, which is to say, what is your understanding of what you believe in as a scholar? So I think while we're in this period of enforced pause and as some are saying, an enforced kind of reflection, you could choose to reach out to another researcher or other researchers in your area, in your college, people that you're engaging with through one form or another. And I would say literally in an open-ended way, have this conversation. Where do you want to position yourself and align yourself as a scholar? I would also say this is the moment, if we were in a real workshop, where somebody would say, I reject all kinds of labels. I would say that rejection of labels is potentially its own kind of label, so we could have a conversation about that. But you could still have that discussion with a colleague. You could talk to someone about why do you reject these labels, and what is it that is underpinning your skepticism of them, or your belief that they're not adequate or not ethical, whatever that might be. It's still, I think, a basis from which you can learn to speak with authority, to say, this is what I believe in, these are the values that underpin the research I do. I would strongly encourage you to do that. You could do it through writing, you could do it through discussion, you could do it through blogging or meditating, whatever it is you like. But once you've done it and reflected on it, I would also encourage you to think about this question. What might your supervisor say? Now, sometimes it's really obvious that supervisor and PhD student are very well aligned in their the kind of the paradigm, the methodology, the philosophy that underpins the research. Sometimes the alignment is actually purely on the basis of kind of subject or topic area. It might be that two people are working on the same kind of question, but taking different approaches. It's very helpful to try to reflect on where you're up to in shaping your own scholarly identity, and then to try to do the kind of the empathy work, the relative work of asking yourself, and does that explain why sometimes you don't understand what your supervisor is saying, or why sometimes you think your supervisor isn't understanding where you're coming from? There are no right or wrong answers here, and of course one could choose to have this conversation with one's supervisor if they were willing and interested. But actually, I think it's also just a reflective, empathetic exercise. And this process of going through the first year review, the whole idea of it that one might step back and ask bigger questions about one's progress, I think should also touch on identity and your emerging scholarly identity. I wanted obviously to say a few words about the oral examination itself. this is one of those areas, like I said at the intro of the first video, where it is not possible really to say this is what you should expect of your oral examination. It's even less possible given this period of home working, whether your viva might take place when we're back in the office, or whether it might take place via video conferencing, whether it will be 30 minutes or 3 hours, though I think it's unlikely it will be 3 hours. But each faculty, each department, each degree committee, as I've said elsewhere, has slightly different expectations around this. So the same advice I gave you earlier obtains here. Speak to your supervisor, speak to your advisor, speak to the graduate administrator in your department, and in particular speak to second years who have recently gone through this process and ask them what happened in their oral examination. But I did ask the PhD examiners, who we have been hearing from throughout this session, what they thought the objectives of the oral examination were, which is to say, why is there an oral examination over and above simply giving feedback on the written document? So, discuss the work submitted, test hypothesis and methodologies, tease out complex ideas, reflect on scope, and make changes if necessary. And it seems to me that very much like the written work that we looked at a few moments ago, this is pretty much the list you would have come up with if I had asked you to brainstorm what you thought the purpose of the oral examination was. So again, I don't think it's that the purpose of the oral examination is impossible to discern or particularly wild and outrageous. I think underneath discuss the work submitted, it possibly is true that in years gone by, there was an element of checking that the work was really your own. I.e., did you write the thing that you had submitted and could you talk about it? I think in this day and age, and particularly thinking around all the plagiarism software that is available, that's less a concern than it might once have been. I think testing the hypothesis and the methodologies and teasing out complex ideas, this seems to me to be what we've been talking about all the way through, is a chance to step back from the day-to-day grind of getting the work done and look at those bigger, almost horizon scanning kind of conversations. You know, is the big idea here going to work? Does it stand up to scrutiny? Are you able to describe it? Can you, in particular, in speech, in the mini viva, can you find a different way to express something that might be unclear to the reader? And that is something which is always going to happen throughout your academic career, that you will write something and you will have invested an enormous amount of time and effort into how best to put it across, and it still might not land with your audience. That is inherent in communication. It's not a failing, but it's again, it's a useful opportunity to get a window into how people are reading your emerging hypothesis, and the complex ideas that you're working on, especially if you're engaging with complex theoretical or philosophical material. Can you find a way to distill it clearly? This is where also, if the examiners in your mini viva don't come from your very niche subfield, you'll get a really strong steer about how well you are communicating the complexity of your thinking. And the last one there, reflect on scope and make changes if necessary. We've discussed this elsewhere. I was able to share a very positive story about my own experience of this. The examiners will be specifically wanting to have a conversation with you about where you go from here. How are you going to use this written work that you've done, the kind of the thinking and the effort that's gone into that, and this opportunity to discuss it? How are you going to use those two things as a springboard to getting the PhD done on time? I did say as well that I just wanted to finish with what the PhD examiners I interviewed would regard as causes for concern. Which is to say, we often get asked, what are the PhD examiners going to be looking out for? The first year examiners, sorry. What are they going to be looking out for? What are they going to be worried about? What might get me into trouble, as it were? And I think, I hope we've addressed as we go through that actually it's not about that. It's not about being on red alert, looking out for people who've made a slight error in a reference somewhere, or who haven't quite expressed the complexity of their thinking in quite the right way. But it is worth, I think, just considering what might be a cause for concern. So this is the list that I put together from what the examiners said. Mental distress in the student, failure to produce work, unfinished or scrappy work, plagiarism, serious gaps in knowledge, and I would say very endearingly, one of the examiners put in brackets, assuming I know enough about the material to spot them, problems with ethics, no relation between submitted work and thesis plan, and lack of rigour in the argumentation. And again, I would have thought that this is the list that you could have come up with if I'd asked you to reflect on it. I think mental distress actually was the one that came out top. That's what all of the examiners were saying that they look for is, and that goes right back to the heart of what we said earlier. Why are we asking you to take this, go through this kind of extended reflective process at the end of a third term before you embark on the registration to become a doctoral candidate and before the clock starts ticking on getting the PhD finished? The answer is also that it's about checking, is PhD research right for you? Have you found this process engaging and enriching and exciting, or has it been stressful? Are there signs that you're either unlikely to complete on time, or that actually maybe in fact doing a PhD is not the right thing for you to be doing? Again, I go back to what I said in the first video. We asked the Board of Graduate Studies how many people are failed through the first year registration process, and they said the number is so small that we can't even give you a percentage on it. I just wanted to flag as well, plagiarism. There is specific advice that you can get. The university has lots of guidance around plagiarism, including self-plagiarism, and I would strongly encourage you to look into that if you don't feel confident about your understanding at the moment. And problems with ethics, I think in many ways that really comes down to either you haven't understood that you will need ethical approval for something that you were planning to do, though it would really, I think, on the whole be surprising if that hadn't become clear in discussion with your supervisor. More often than not, when we talk about problems with ethics, what we're really talking about is approval not being granted or approval taking too long. So that is where an element of project planning comes in and thinking about the timeline. It is the case that in the oral examination you will be asked to reflect on all of the work submitted, so not just the written piece, the 10,000 words, whether that is the literature review or a draft chapter. You'll also be asked to reflect on the thesis plan if you've submitted one, on your timeline, on your professional development plan that you included. So what would worry the assessors, I think, is if you've submitted some work that or you've submitted a documentation that you're then not able to talk about. And here, let's finish. Let's bring everything together. I just wanted to end with this quote from one of the PhD examiners I interviewed, because I thought it was really encouraging and seems to me to really lean on the idea that this is a positive developmental process. The one thing I've learned is that the strongest candidates are not the cleverest or the most brilliant ones, but the ones who take on board feedback and do something with it. And really what we have to see the first year report as being is a crucial, pivotal opportunity to reflect and an opportunity to get feedback. And the written work and the oral examination are your chance to positively engage with some readers for your work. And it is often the case with PhD research that apart from what one publishes in journals or book chapters or presents at a conference, large portions of what you write for the PhD may never be read by anyone other than your supervisor or your examiners. So the opportunity to get feedback is, and it sounds cheesy, but it is a gift, because the chance to get someone whose job it is to read and think seriously about what you've written and share their views on it with you is not always easy to come by. And I think it's really worth reflecting on the fact that your responsibility here is both to do the work that you've been asked to do and to engage positively in the process, but then to do something with the feedback that you received. And that you can do through discussion with your supervisor, through reflection, etc. But that's really what this is. It's a chance to put something out there for discussion, get feedback on it, and then for you to make a plan about what you're going to do with it. So that's the end of this online module on writing your first year report for PhD students in the arts, humanities and social sciences. I hope you found some of it useful. I hope that you also particularly valued the quotations from the interviews with the PhD examiners. I hope that brought to life the advice. If you have further questions or concerns, then please by all means do get in touch. My email address is sj232, or you can email researcher.development@admin.cam.ac.uk. And also, this is new for us, as I've said, doing these online modules, and particularly at this somewhat unusual time. So if you have feedback, if you have comments, if there are things you'd like more of, things you'd like less of, then we'd love to hear from you on that as well. So drop us an email, you can tweet us, or you can send a carrier pigeon. Okay, stay well, look after yourselves, and very best of luck with the first year registration process.